You are listening to a change-making conversation with Baptist News Global. But sometimes change-making conversations are difficult to have, so we're offering a content warning before you begin listening. If you or a loved one might be experiencing sexual abuse, call the National Sexual Assault Hotline, 1-800-656-4673. Please listen with care. Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Over the past week, a large part of the conversation at Baptist News Global in both print and podcasts has focused on sexual abuse, with a seemingly odd detour that included AI Donald Trump children's books and a conversation about hell. Just look at the top 5 most read articles from last week. At number 5 was Krista Brown's piece titled Southern Baptist Leaders' Duplicity Betrays Abuse Survivors. In it, she said, quote, "If nothing else is clear from the newly released documents, it should be this. The SBC and its institutions lacked sufficient structures or processes to investigate claims of abuse," unquote. Coming in at number 4 was my piece titled, Now AI Trump Reads Bible Stories for Children. In this article, I talk about a series of children's books that feature AI Donald Trump reading the stories about the birth of Jesus, the flood, and David and Goliath. I demonstrate how the books are creating a narrative that everyone must bend the knee to King Jesus as defined by Christian nationalist Republicans, or face a justice of violent retribution handed out by Christian nationalist Republicans. The number 3 article for BNG last week was titled Former Truett McConnell VP Indicted in Georgia. It was written by Joe Westbury. It was about former Truett McConnell University Vice President Bradley Reynolds being indicted for lying to law enforcement during an investigation about a years-long alleged abuse relationship with a student and former employee. The number 2 most read article was my second piece of the week, titled Heads Spin as Kirk Cameron Gives Up Eternal Conscious Torment. The actor and evangelical influencer recently did a podcast episode with his son where he said he was no longer convinced by the eternal conscious torment view of hell. So conservative evangelicals are having a collective conniption fit over it. I include reactions from Owen Strachan, Megan Basham, Albert Mohler, and others. And the most read piece for the week was the extensive article by David Baumgardner and Mark Wingfield titled Court Records Reveal Tangled Trail in Sills Sexual Abuse Case. In this piece, Baumgardner and Wingfield discuss court discovery documents in the defamation lawsuit involving former Southern Baptist Theological Seminary professor David Sills and Jennifer Lyle, where high-level leaders were informed of serious misconduct allegations. It was such a bombshell report that I appeared along with Baumgardner and Mallory Chalice for a conversation with Mark Wingfield and Ben Cole on BNG's Stuck in the Middle with You podcast late last week. During our conversation, we began to notice a pattern in the sexual abuse cases of the SBC. And as we talked, I think we hit on the reality that all 5 of BNG's top articles of last week are connected. The part of our conversation on Stuck in the Middle with You that I'd like to highlight began with this question from Ben Cole.
Let me ask you this, Mallory, to take it back to Kanakuk. It amazes me that with all of the bad press of Kanakuk, that there are families who still send their kids to that camp.
From my neighborhood.
It amazes me that with you know, the enrollment numbers at Southern Seminary are not reduced.
Right.
The church rolls in independent fundamental Baptist churches, they're not now. Gateway Church may be the outlier here in Dallas. They are hollowed out, almost emptied because of that abuse. But Mallory and Rick, why is it that even when you have national news that is again and again and again garnering headlines and like layers of an onion, you keep finding out more and more and more, why is it that people still send their kids or actively participate in the ministries of people who are perpetrators and institutions which have enabled it?
Yeah. Mallory?
Yeah. So one of the things that I uncovered when I was doing the podcast was that during the time when when parents were sort of discovering that their children were being abused, they were going back to their mostly Southern Baptist, not all Southern Baptists, but mostly Southern Baptist churches, and telling their pastors, hey, like, this happened to my kid at camp. Maybe we should not send the youth group there anymore. Maybe we should not be promoting Kanakuk. Maybe you should do something about this with your pastoral authority. And like across the board, parents told me that their pastors sat down with them and said, we hear you. We have known that this abuse is going on, but Kanakuk is doing so much for the Lord. They are getting so many conversions of children.
There you go.
That we do not want to stop supporting them. And so while your children's abuse is important, the ministry and the evangelicalism of Kanakuk is more important. And that is so bizarre to me.
Oh, it's not bizarre to me at all. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Right.
It's still bizarre.
It's bizarre, but no, I believe it.
You understand.
I believe it. Yeah. And Rick, I wonder how that parallels with your experience as well.
Yeah, the one thing that I would often hear would be whether in pretense or in truth the gospel's being preached. And so if abuse is happening, we need to just kind of quietly go away, because otherwise we're going to shut down the ministry and the gospel won't be preached. Another one was that they would quote, I think it was somewhere in 1 Corinthians about, they would say that the world isn't supposed to sit in judgment over the Christians. And so basically, anything that happens should be handled internally. The government has no right to say anything about the abuse that's happening within our walls.
So I would just interject here for the record, and this is a whole nother conversation. I believe the greatest untold story of sexual abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention is what has happened through the decades on the international mission field with missionaries who were abusive. And there were administrators who discovered, who knew. There were other people in the mission who covered it up, who protected for the very same reasons. And I've scratched the surface of this enough through my career with some individuals that I know where there's smoke, there's got to be a big bonfire. But we may never know that, but it's the very same dynamic you're talking about, because the gospel is being preached.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you think about, like, with missions, on a positive standpoint, there's a lot you can get away with in another country that you can't hear. You'll often hear about women being able to do things overseas that they couldn't do in the United States. But like on the negative side, then you have a toxic person who's going to abuse people. They're also going to get away with things overseas in a village that they couldn't do here.
Well, it's not just with the locals that this is happening, but it's also within the mission organizations. I know of cases where you have like a father figure in the mission, the collection of missionaries, who perpetually wants the young girls to sit on his lap, for example.
And Mark, to strike while the iron is hot, the missions connection is interesting. In Geiger's deposition, he notes that Lyle alleges that really the very first sexual assault happened on an international mission trip, both in the field and on the plane ride back. And along the lines of abuse stories that have yet to be told from other SBC entities. While we're talking about the IMB, I think it would be wise to also bring up Lifeway, again, Jennifer Lyle's former employer, and the fact that Lifeway administrates and oversees fuge camps and the abuse stories that have yet to be told from fuge camps that are matters of public record.
Well, in June of 2019, while the convention is in the throes of this abuse case, Lifeway was dealing with another claim of abuse that happened in Arizona in June of 2019 while this is all going on.
Yeah, at which then they end up leading the effort to file that amicus brief in Kentucky against the survivor, which is a whole nother conversation.
So with that question on the table about some kind of connection between missions, evangelism, and abuse, we picked up on the theme again a few minutes later in a more extended conversation. I'm going to play this part of the interview in its entirety because I think it's really crucial that we get this context in order to address what's going on with sexual abuse in conservative Christian ministries.
Look, there are just so many layers of this issue. What is so odd to me, as I was going back and reviewing the chronology and the timeline, David Sills isn't the only Southern Baptist professor to have had a moral failing that involved sexual sin or allegations of sexual sin during a very small window. I mean, it was like the dominoes started falling, such that Mohler wrote publicly, "This is the judgment of God revealed." Like this is clear. There is a reckoning that is happening. Alvin Reed, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, professor of evangelism, dismissed from Southeastern because of sexual sin. David Sills, gone from Southern because of professor of missions and evangelism. Johnny Hunt, Mr. Evangelism in Southern Baptist Life, leading the evangelism department of the North American Mission Board. Sexual sin. Christian George, professor at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, dismissed. Sexual sin. Frank Page, who had a PhD in evangelism from Southwestern, as Southern Baptists have been trying to deal with the last 10 years, why are we not having success in evangelism? Why are our baptism numbers down? It's kind of occurred to me that sort of the hotbed, the breeding ground, for lack of a better word, of so much that's gone wrong in the SBC are among these evangelism people.
Yeah, what's up with that?
I don't have an answer. I'm just observing.
Ben, it's funny you should bring that up. I had a dear friend who also serves as a professor at a Southern Baptist seminary, one of the six, and I won't reveal his name or position, but he relayed to me after we had noticed the evangelism connection. I mean, even Paige Patterson, formerly held the chair of fire, helped get it endowed. Matt Queen, former chair of fire at my alma mater, Southwestern Seminary, indicted for obstructing justice and falsifying evidence in a federal investigation. Evangelism. Yeah. That's. I think these are the used car salesmen of evangelical life.
Look, there's much here. Don't get me talking about Paige. Someone should write a book.
Someone
Let me say this. Someone should publish the book.
Someone should publish the book they've already written.
Right.
Yes.
And there may be reasons why they have not yet. There's something to, and I don't have the answer here. There is something to the way that Southern Baptists have done missions and evangelism. Particularly, and you mentioned the mission boards and how the IMB, I mean, the stories of what happened behind closed doors overseas and how people were moved around, shifted around. B&G's covered this. People that came home from the field and worked for the North American Mission Board and continued cycles of abuse. I'm not saying that everyone that's involved in missions, evangelism, promotion, and training somehow has a propensity to this, but we ought to start asking the question, and I don't have the answer. Why is it that there is this common thread when you start to pull it? That it's folks that have been proponents and platformed for these particular issues where the worst cases are being reported. And this could tie into so much of what Rick has done, because if there's one thing independent fundamental Baptists do, I mean, it is soul winning. It is you can go, the guys who are some of the worst abusers in IFB history were some of the loudest mouths about soul winning and evangelism. And then what Mallory said is the reason that we continue to support the ministries is because of the evangelism that is being done, the souls that are being won.
That's right.
So there's something here. And I don't know what's at the center of this Venn diagram, but it is underexplored both journalistically and academically, and I think in terms of just some honest conversations that need to be had.
Yeah, as you talk, I'm thinking to bring it closer to home about someone I know who is currently in prison on significant child pornography charges, who was a Southern Baptist and a CBF Baptist minister in Texas and other places, who was all about evangelism and outreach, and it's the same thing.
Well, Robert Morris, when he abused a 12-year-old girl, he was a traveling evangelist staying in their home. Like, we're gonna get hate letters from the Conference of Southern Baptist Evangelists. If they want my email, I can give it to them. Send them to me because I'm happy to respond. But there is a common thread here that is underexplored and underreported, and it's time we start having that honest conversation.
Yeah, and this also ties into Kanakuk. Because Kanakuk is all about getting young kids to make professions of faith so they can ring the bell and pass through. Am I right, Mallory?
Oh, yeah. The crosstalk night that I talk about ad nauseum in my podcast is sort of like their claim to fame. That like this is where we get all of the children to like dedicate their lives to Christ when they, watch this scene of like us acting out Jesus' crucifixion, and it's really gory and scary, and they say, "Oh, look, you'll get abused if you don't repent for your sins." And really what's happening is that they're getting abused at Kanakuk, and it's just
and it gets tangled up. So again, we're back to this tangled web of bad theology with abusive experiences. So, like we're back to got to go to the basement and satisfy the patriarch. And it becomes a theological mess.
Well, no one, I mean, I'm just observing things. But at the time that the Jen Lyle case erupts, she's an employee at Lifeway. Her CEO at Lifeway during the time that all this unfolds is Ben Mandrell, now pastor at Bellevue Baptist Church. We've done a podcast on this, but he cut his teeth at Kanakuk.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that there's anything to that, but just the coincidence of these things becomes you can't miss sort of. The coincidences of all of these details have gotten to the point where you can't dismiss them as artificial or arbitrary.
So, and Ben, just a follow-up detail about Lifeway. When Jennifer Lyle makes her initial disclosure privately in 2018, there's a conference call, and on this call are Albert Mohler, president of Southern Seminary, Adam Greenway, interestingly enough, dean of the Billy Graham School of Evangelism, Eric Geiger, former VP, now a pastor, and Tom Rainer, who cut his teeth on church revitalization. And if you just type in Tom Rainer evangelism, Tom Rainer church revitalization, you will see article upon article from his blog Church Answers and from Lifeway Research, how to make your church more evangelistic, the death of evangelism, the 10, 15 issues we must address to reverse trends, how to lead your church to be effective local missionaries. I mean, it is stunning. And it is on this call that Jennifer Lyle discloses to Rainer, Geiger, Mohler, and Greenway that she, in the words of an internal memo obtained from Southern Seminary, was the victim of sexual contact and misconduct that was, quote, all unwanted. And here's a question. If that was the case, why did none of these men have enough sense to call law enforcement?
Yeah, no call was made to police that we know of. I've got something I want to say about that in just a moment, but Rick, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, you look at a lot of these terms that are being used, like church revitalization, evangelism, missions. These are all really exciting things. These are about accomplishing things for God. And yet, if you look at the reasons people are giving for covering up abuse, it's very fear-based. We don't want someone to go to hell because we, made this ministry go down the tubes. And so I think there's just this, there's a contrast here between the excitement of evangelism and the natural overwhelming fear that's present in this conversation as well. And I wonder if there's that fear is connected to the control that we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think so.
Feel they have to submit to.
And I want to bring this full circle by highlighting something we didn't report, but that is in Jennifer Lyle's own deposition, which is gut-wrenching to read. And a repeated example she gives is allegedly being at David Sill's home in the basement, and he is forcing her to perform oral sex on him. And when he completes the act, he tells her, now go clean up your face so you're not a sinner. Let that sink in.
Oh, wow.
Which comes with judgment. Like you're a sinner, you need to be judged.
Yeah, so you're a sinner for what I just made you do to me.
Yeah.
That she now has to grapple with.
Did I get that right, David?
You did, and if I could just add on to that, I mean, I have a copy of the deposition here. Here's what she says from page 297. And so then he had rules such as that after you repent, because of 1 John 1:9, you can never speak of whatever you've repented of, or that's blasphemous. So not only is it you need to go repent, but you can't tell anybody about what you've repented of because it's blasphemy to bring up sins in the past.
Which is an unforgivable sin.
Blasphemy.
Like the blasphemy, the ultimate sin, if you were to do this.
Yeah,
Again,
and here's where we are.
One of the things I've been saying for years is that whenever abuse is happening in the church, you can bet that a theology of eternal conscious torment is hiding around the corner. This is simply a fact. People who listen to or read Baptist News Global know that Ben Cole is a conservative, and that others of us are more liberal. He and Mark have discussed hell in a previous episode of Stuck in the Middle with You. But despite whatever differences we may have, including on the topic of hell, we were all noticing an unmistakable connection between missions, evangelism, and sexual abuse. As Mallory and I both shared, one connection among conservative, independent, or Southern Baptists is their fear of people going to hell if they don't repent. So if a church, camp, school, or any type of ministry is converting people, then the fear becomes that you don't want to put anyone's soul in jeopardy by reporting sexual abuse and then turning someone off to the church. That brings me to my second article from last week about Kirk Cameron starting to question his beliefs about hell as eternal conscious torment. As I wrote in my intro, Cameron said, quote, "It's one of the doctrines of the Bible that atheists love to point out as one of the reasons why they could never believe in the God of the Bible. It's the God who creates the eternal barbecue for sinners." I'm going to share some audio here from the podcast where Kirk Cameron and his son James begin to explore how they feel about the idea that hell is eternal conscious torment. If you haven't seen the video of them talking, I'll link to a reel in the Substack I send out for this episode. It's helpful to see Kirk closing his eyes tight, shaking his head, raising his eyebrows, and rubbing his cheeks because you can feel how deeply his inner humanity is wrestling with the inhumanity of it all.
Let's dive in. What do you got?
Yeah, so I think the concept that I've heard most of my life is that hell is eternal, and it's essentially eternal conscious torment.
Right.
That the wicked will go into the lake of fire and perish and be tortured essentially forever.
Right.
And I hadn't really questioned that because I wasn't all that interested.
Yeah, nobody wants to go there. Let's just avoid it altogether.
At the time,
and it doesn't
was just
really
uncomfortable,
matter.
so I didn't want to talk about it. And I think that's the opinion of, I would say, probably most Christians.
Yeah.
That they kind of just throw that phrase around a little bit. Like, you're going to go to the lake of fire and burn. It's essentially like the fire and brimstone.
Yeah, turn or burn. You hear that stuff all the time.
Exactly. And I think it's important to understand what you're saying when you say that.
Yeah.
If you believe in eternal conscious torment, it's not just that. What you're actually saying is that if you are a sinner and you don't give your life to Christ, you go to hell, and you are in agony, tortured, screaming, crying, in pain,
weeping, wailing,
on fire. Not just for 100 years, not just for 1,000 years, but for all of eternity. That for literally, we can't even imagine how vast eternity is.
After 10,000 years of anguish and pain and torment and darkness, you're not one day closer to finding relief.
You're not even 1 second closer.
After 1 billion years, you're not 1 second closer to the end.
Yeah, and I think that
I can't even wrap my mind around it, honestly.
I know.
It's such a massive, overwhelming thought that my mind cannot contain it any more than this cup can contain the ocean. That's what it feels like to me.
Yeah. And I think just after having that realization of the belief that many people hold, it made a bunch of questions come up in my mind. For instance, we're born into sin, and nobody has ever gone through life without sinning.
Right. Everybody has sinned.
Yeah. Another question is, if I was to sin every single second from the moment I was born till the second that I die, would the just punishment of that be? An eternity of torture.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that just?
Is that just?
Is that just because we think of God as a just God? He is a just God. And we believe that the punishment should fit the crime.
Exactly.
And so if the punishment was cruel and unusual punishment that went far beyond the severity of the crime, that would no longer be just. Mm-hmm. So is that really just? An eternity of conscious torment for a limited lifetime of sin?
This is all under the umbrella of our belief in a just God, in a fair God, in a righteous God.
Yeah.
So if somebody
and a merciful God.
And a merciful
and
God.
a merciful God.
Yeah, the scriptures are full of God's mercy and when people have turned away from him.
Yeah, that's right. God limits his justice all the time in the scriptures. Right? The woman caught in the act of adultery, he limits his justice, which would have resulted in her death, and says, neither do I condemn you. Jesus said, go and sin no more. Just the fact that you and I are alive right now is the limiting of God's justice. He didn't give us what we deserved. He gave us mercy instead.
It was interesting how Kirk's son James Cameron said it's important to name what you're actually saying when you say you believe in eternal conscious torment. I get more detailed in my piece about what they talked about, as well as about alternatives that have been accepted as Orthodox Christianity throughout the history of the church that do not include eternal conscious torment. But if this conversation is affecting Kirk and James Cameron to the degree that it is, imagine telling 7-year-olds that. I remember being told about eternal conscious torment when I was 4, and my 2-year-old brother was in the room. So who knows how early I was being told I deserved to be eternally tortured? How can a 4-year-old process burning for eternity? Or imagine telling teenagers who are beginning to experience sexual desire that even if they masturbate, they're in danger of burning in hell for eternity. Suddenly, during a time when they're experiencing arousal throughout the day, each time they experience it, their bodies get triggered to fear the most infinite bodily pain imaginable, burning for eternity. Again, if Kirk Cameron, the 55-year-old evangelical superstar, is overwhelmed at the thought, imagine how a 12-year-old, a 7-year-old, or a 4-year-old would be. Evangelical adults who talk about hell like it's just this truth to believe in have no concept of the trauma talking like that causes. How can you possibly talk about burning for eternity in a way that's not going to foster that level of trauma and fear? You're supposed to just ponder burning for eternity amongst brimstone and worms and just be like, okay, that's fine, and move along with your decision-making process? It's impossible. It is spiritually abusive because it is absolutely impossible to live your life in any kind of informed way with that theology without either becoming overwhelmed with trauma or suppressing the trauma that your body knows it feels. As I said on Stuck in the Middle with You, conservatives love to brand what they're doing in positive terms, like church revitalization, evangelism, missions, soul winning, or expanding the kingdom. But at the heart of all those terms, as defined by these conservative ministries, is the threat of being set on fire for eternity as you swim between the brimstone and scream with worms crawling throughout your body. You put that level of fear into a view of reality as a hierarchy of authority and submission, led by men who feel they are entitled to your submission, with the threat of infinite violence done to your body for not submitting, and you have a soil that is ripe for abuse. You have a recipe that is going to fuel unimaginable fear for anyone that takes it seriously. And with that level of fear comes the response of control. And when everything is interpreted as authority and submission, comes the entitlement that we see. And that entitlement and control brings about the sexual abuse. Cole said on our Stuck in the Middle with You conversation, quote, "There's something here, and I don't know what's at the center of this Venn diagram, but it's underexplored both journalistically and academically, and I think in terms of just some honest conversations that need to be had," unquote. I think we are having that conversation. I think it's present in a lot of what BNG produces. It's certainly present in everything that I'm putting out, if you're paying attention and reading between the lines. In fact, I try to be quite specific almost to a disturbing degree because I don't want you to have to read between the lines. Because the trauma that we experienced as kids isn't between the lines. It's ever present for millions of children every day. and it needs to be healed. But I don't think conservatives can have this conversation honestly, because ultimately, no matter how uncomfortable or disturbing it may be for them, they have to defend the top-down violence of the cross and the top-down violence of hell because they think it's biblical. By definition of being a conservative evangelical, they have to believe that justice is violent retribution against human bodies, either through crucifixion or eternal conscious torment. Mallory Chalice explores some of this in the Non-Disclosure podcast series on the Change-Making Conversations feed, especially in episode 5 titled Lethal Theologies, How Christian Institutions Are Made Ripe for Abuse. Listen to what Mallory said about atonement theologies during one part of that episode.
But what does worship have to do with sexual abuse? Several theologians have noted the danger of atonement theology, which at its core is related to how it is possible for sin to be forgiven. The crucifixion narrative is important to understanding this, but some atonement theories heavily emphasize the violence of the cross, sometimes glorifying it, making it confusing for victims of violence to situate themselves in these theological frameworks. This is because these violence-centered atonement theories emphasize submission to abuse as a salvation-achieving act. In Jesus' case, this was his submission to the Roman crucifixion process. But they fail to acknowledge this abuse was an injustice, and submission was the goal of Jesus' abusers, not God. Jesus was a victim of a cruel leadership regime that publicly abused his body to ensure everyone else who witnessed the event was too afraid to be insubordinate to the regime. But God brought on his resurrection in defeat of this injustice.
What Mallory promoted was a view of the atonement that doesn't foster fear because it recognizes God's presence in and among the oppressed, and because it finds hope in God's power of resurrection from the worst empire could ever do to us. In all of these conservative evangelical versions of the gospel, God is essentially Rome. God is essentially the centurions. God is essentially the emperor, except to an infinite degree, and the authority to an infinite degree, and the violence to an infinite degree. Thus, the control and the entitlement producing the abuse that we see today. And that's why all 5 of BNG's most read pieces last week were related. They all either dealt with views of justice that glorified violence against human bodies, or protected institutions from being exposed for violence against human bodies, or they were about applications of theology that abused human bodies. And the common thread in them all was excusing abuse out of fear of God torturing the souls of the abused. But what would that say about God? It's beyond gross. It's sickening. And it needs to be deconstructed all the way to the ground so that people can begin to heal from the wounds of this theology and of the institutions this theology protects. The reason so much sexual abuse keeps happening in the contexts of evangelism and missions is that evangelism and missions are contexts that are drowning in fear of eternal conscious torment being executed on human bodies that won't submit to the pleasure of the powerful. That's all for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.